I don't think I've ever been quite as concerned about the state of affairs in the United Kingdom and around the world as I am right now. I spent the weekend telling you about the government's non-response to a petition of almost 3 million people that want them ousted, what people have described as car crash and clueless interviews where Angela Rayner, our deputy PM, couldn't decide whether there was a housing crisis or plenty of housing to go around, all the while not telling you whether or not those houses are going to migrants, followed by welcoming the news that Assad has been ousted from Syria, but failing to tell you that it's been ousted by what is still currently on the list of proscribed terrorist organisations in the United Kingdom. But it's the news that pops up this morning that has me most concerned, and there's plenty of it, so please stay tuned. But first of all, if you are new to me, I'm Daniel Shensmith, a barrister of England and Wales. I've covered thousands of videos talking about legal topics on this channel that you can dive into. I'd be really grateful if you subscribe to the channel and support my channel. I'm independent. I depend on you watching, subscribing, liking and sharing my videos to reach a much wider audience. So let's first of all take a look at what caught my eye this morning. Well, the first letter from Rupert Lowe MP to the Home Secretary about someone who shouldn't even be in the country because he's here illegally and has been arrested and not deported, despite having 17 previous convictions. And this is Rupert Lowe's letter to the Home Secretary. An illegal immigrant named alias Ambulta has been jailed following arrest for drug dealing in my constituency, he writes, of Great Yarmouth. Norwich Crown Court was told that he'd been released from prison a month before his arrest. The Great Yarmouth Mercury reports that this Lithuanian has used 5 different dates of birth, 5 fake names in the past. He's received 17 previous convictions despite being in the country illegally and subjected to immigration bail. He's now been jailed for 15 weeks. My first question, why has this man not already been deported? My second question, will you commit to immediately deporting this man? If a foreign national comes to the UK and commits crime, they should be deported. Let me know in the comments if you agree with that, by the way. This is not a racist thing to say or comment on or discuss. This is a fact. If someone is here illegally and commits a crime, it's a genuine question. Should they be deported? Let me know in the comments what you think. This individual has numerous convictions, yet has remained in our country to offend and offend again. Why has this been tolerated? Great Yarmouth is suffering as a result of soft sentencing and a weak approach to deportation. We need immediate removal of all foreign criminals. I look forward to your speedy response and urgent action on this important issue. Now, speaking very broadly here, if we are to protect our country in the sense that we protect the borders, we protect the citizens, we protect the integrity of the justice system, the immigration system, etc., these are very valid questions. If these criminals, on the face of it, are in the country illegally, should we not be removing them from this country? And should we not protect our country and borders and immigration and the integrity of the system by removing those people? These are genuine questions raised, and in a democratic society, they should be raised, they should be answered, and we should have answers to those questions from the Home Secretary. But recently, Home Secretary has not been forthcoming on information and answers to other members of Parliament, including Rupert Lowe. For example, one that I covered just recently, where Rupert Lowe asked in Parliament on the 25th of November about publishing the crimes committed, the number of crimes committed by illegal migrants. Despite the positive answer, Rupert says, we still do not have this information. The government is treating us with contempt, he argues. Watch for yourself. Now, there's a very valid question here. I'll play you this clip in just a moment, but there's a very valid question here. Should the government not publish this information because we, the public, are entitled to it? Listen to this question in Parliament from Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Home Secretary would agree with me that good government is transparent government. I've been told by her department in response to a written question that the number of crimes committed by illegal migrants is not available through published statistics. I'm sure that the Home Office does hold the data, so would the Minister today commit to publishing that information in full?
Here.
Mr. Speaker, there's a huge statistical drop of immigration-related national statistics coming at the end of this week.
So a non-answer, really. So the question was very, very specific. The question was, This data, he's been told, is not publicly available, but he is sure that the government does hold this data. Will they commit to publishing it? The response was, there's a huge drop of information coming at the end of the week. One might infer that that information is within that block of information, but that information has not been made available. And on top of the concerns about crimes being committed around the country, we read from The Telegraph, I'll link this article below, that thousands of police officers face losing their job because of a £300 million shortfall in the funding settlement. Now, with this government spending money left, right, centre and, of course, abroad, one might think that they can find £300 million is really a drop in the ocean compared to what's being spent elsewhere to fund our own police forces, all of whom are dedicated to protecting the public and all of whom we should ensure have proper funding. But that wasn't even the most alarming thing that I read this morning. The most alarming thing I read this morning was the government's response to this currently proscribed terror organisation overthrowing Assad in Syria. More about that in just a moment. Now, having noticed that lots of you enjoy my news coverage just recently, and appreciating the fact that I try to remain neutral and objective, though I don't always succeed, some of you may wonder whether you are being fed left-wing views, right-wing views, and whether you are really getting the full picture of what's going on. And to that end, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Ground News, which is both an app and a website which pulls together and collates the world's news across the political spectrum. It shows you at a glance any political bias in the news sources that you read, a credibility score so that you know how accurate the news is that you are reading, and even an indication as to ownership if that is something that matters to you. For example, is it owned by a small independent company or a huge media conglomerate? You can search for news by using a keyword or even the URL of an article that you've already read. Let's take this article by way of example, where Louise Haigh was sort of forced to resign because it emerged she had a fraud conviction from some years ago. You can see at a glance the points emphasised by the left, the right and the central news outlets, and even a bias comparison, with left-leaning outlets emphasising that it was a genuine mistake and trying to lessen the severity of her actions, whereas the right-leaning outlets adopt a much more critical tone in their headlines, with an emphasis on this being a significant issue for ethical standards in government. Now we can see that reflected in the headlines. Taking some of the left-leaning outlets by way of example, we can see Associated Press focusing on this being a decade-old conviction, again with Metro News focusing on this being an old conviction and that the matter was a genuine mistake from which she did not make any gain. Whereas the language used by the US Sun was much more critical, with Louise Haigh quit after admitting to being a convicted fraudster over her stolen phone claim. And at GB News quit her role just hours after it emerged she's been convicted of fraud, and again under pressure last night after it was revealed she pleaded guilty to fraud. But there are always going to be some articles that are disproportionately represented by either the left or the right. That is exactly why Ground News has a blind spot feature to show you the gaps in coverage across the political spectrum. Taking this article by way of example, Trump warns of hell to pay if Hamas doesn't release the hostages. Across 242 articles, 62% were covered by the right-wing media, only 17% by the left, and 21% of central news outlets. And of course, as a partner to my channel here, I get you a fantastic discount, which is 50% off, that's 50% off, unlimited access to the world's news. You can use the QR code or the link on screen, which is ground.news/BBB, which I'll put down below as well. So the next time you're wondering if you are only being fed one side of the story or the other, check out Ground News and you'll get the full picture. Now, you remember if you watched my video yesterday that I talked about the development in Syria and the overthrowing of Assad. And this was Keir Starmer's response, or the government's response, to those events. He says the developments in Syria in recent hours and days are unprecedented, and we are speaking to our partners in the region and monitoring the situation closely. The Syrian people have suffered under Assad's barbaric regime for too long, and we welcome his departure. All very fine so far. Our focus is now on ensuring a political solution prevails. This is the hint here. Our focus is now on ensuring a political solution prevails. More about that in a moment. And peace and stability is restored. We call on all sides to protect civilians and minorities and ensure essential aid can reach the most vulnerable in the coming days, hours and days. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And it's that third paragraph there. and what isn't in this whole statement that I was concerned about. He says, our focus is now on ensuring a political solution prevails, bearing in mind that this regime, the Assad regime, has been overthrown by rebels that are still, as of this morning, on the government's list of proscribed terror organizations. Now, that's a recap of what I said yesterday, but the alarming news comes in this snippet of a Sky News interview here.
The group that's taken over, the rebels, have been prescribed as a terror group here in the UK. Will they change their minds now? I put that to the government this morning.
We'll consider that, and I think it will partly depend on what happens in terms of how that group behaves now. But I think countries around the world who prescribe this, it's not just the UK, the United States, European countries as well, I think probably will look at that now and see what's going to happen in the future. But we've not made any decisions on that over the weekend.
And how long will it take for you to make a decision?
Well, it won't take that long. I think we'll need to do it quite quickly.
So they're going to quite quickly make a decision as to whether they remove this group from the list of proscribed terrorist organizations. Because they've obviously overthrown Assad, they now need to work to a political solution in the area, all of which is true. But part of the consideration now is to make a quick decision whether or not they are going to remove this organization from that list. It says here, a decision would have to be made quickly about whether to take HTS off the prescribed list. And then says it would depend partly on what happens now in terms of how the group behaves. Well, I'm no expert on international relations, but given that this group is on the terror list and has just overthrown a regime, albeit a terrible one by everyone's account, but given that it's a terror organization that's just overthrown a regime, that shows something of their behavior right from the outset. So I would have thought that this is now an impossible position. This is no criticism really of having to make a decision here. But this is a discussion here because this decision now has to be made. Do they deal with them, even though they're on the list of terrorists, which sounds outrageous, as I say, because they either deal with the country or they don't. And if they deal with them, they can't really deal with them because they're on this list of proscribed organizations, or they take them off the list so that they can deal with them politically and ask them to behave and ask them to run the country properly in a political structure. Now, to give the flip side of this, there has been commentary from former head of British Army's Chemical Weapons Unit to say that the group seemed to be a different organization when he was there in 2020 compared to the last time he was there 7 years before. That's something of a promising statement when he says even in those days they were trying to convince the medical networks that they were helping, that they were a political moderate entity. Despite what's now happened, obviously they've taken it by force. What they're saying now is the same. Syria was always a secular and moderate country, and it's key that all the various factions are bought into this. And if it requires somebody like their leader to do that, then so be it, he says. But I think we need to give them a chance. They're saying the right things. The people of Syria are absolutely delighted, and I want to make things work, but it's going to be a challenge. So I don't for a moment want to take away from the positivity that everybody is talking about here with relinquishing this country of a brutal regime. But these are serious questions. The question is now to deal with this organization either on or off this list, which is quite frankly unprecedented. So I will update you as to what I find out about that in the coming days and weeks. But there's even more than that. We go back now to another snippet of the Angela Rayner interview, which I didn't cover previously, talking about house prices. And once again, not really answering the question. And I frankly, perhaps not even understanding the question and understanding the answers that she's giving, the ramifications. This is about house prices again. So forgive me for jumping around in the news, but this is what's happening. And as I say, this channel really is for me to talk to you about things, to hopefully break things down in a way, give my objective thoughts on these things and what you really need to consider. So looking at this one, this was, would you like prices to come down, was the question. And she responds, it's not necessarily prices coming down, but about supply and making sure those houses are there so people can afford them. So that response doesn't really make sense, but let's have a listen and then I'll give you some information about it, which makes this a bit meaningless nonsense. Listen to this.
Need to come down to make things more affordable.
Well, we've talked about making sure that the elements of the Employment Rights Bill is about making sure people have better pay terms and conditions. We've talked about the affordability. In many areas, it's 8 times an annual salary, way beyond where people can get housing.
Yes, so
that's why supply is important so that people can get those homes. We're doing a mortgage guarantee scheme so that people can get on the housing ladder, because far too often the problem with why...
And just to jump in there with this mortgage guarantee scheme thing, these schemes are often great ideas, but many, many years ago, I was qualified as a mortgage advisor. Well, I suppose I still am qualified as a mortgage advisor. I don't do that anymore, but I qualified as a mortgage advisor, and I was very heavily involved in all of that sort of stuff. And I understand the way this works, and any opportunity where they've had to have mortgage guarantees and sort of discounted or gifted deposits and all of that sort of stuff, for a lot of cases, they simply don't work. They backfire and they blow up, and you end up with ghost town housing estates where people have not had to put the money in themselves. They don't have any real risk themselves, so when they can't afford it, they just leave. So that is a disaster waiting to happen, and I've seen it firsthand, but let's listen on.
House prices are going up so quickly is because supply is in demand, and we haven't fixed the supply problem.
But would you like prices to come down? Because a lot of people watching this morning might think, what's the point of this huge effort to get homes built if actually prices don't come down?
It's not necessarily prices coming down, it's about supply and making sure that those houses are there and available so that people can afford them and are able to get them. Because if we don't fix supply, then house prices will continue to go up as demand goes up.
So this, with great respect to Angela Rayner here, this is meaningless nonsense. She's talking about supply and demand and prices going up and prices coming down, almost as though they're all separate things and they're not connected, and doesn't really seem to understand it. Supply and demand, of course, affects the price. And she said it's not about prices coming down so that people can afford them. It's about increasing the supply so that prices don't continue to go up. But it's not even as simple as that, because when we move over to what's actually affecting people, such as first-time buyers buying properties, there's a tweet here which sort of prompted me to look into a couple of things from Kevin Hollenrake here. War on first-time buyers, he says. Labour axes support for those looking to get on the first rung of the housing ladder. And so this is affecting stamp duty relief. There's a reduction. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the right to buy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, we look at stamp duty, which obviously affects all buyers. Now, the current rate is set at 5% of the property value over £425,000. But the changes, which are going to be running counterintuitive to this whole idea of trying to help people to afford to buy houses for the first time, is being lowered as of the 31st of March 2025 to values over £300,000. So even if prices did come down by over £100,000, then you are still then going to have to pay stamp duty, which is adding to the cost of buying those properties. So again, running counterintuitive to this notion of being able to afford those properties. Moving now to the right to buy discounts. These were introduced in 1980 to enable social housing tenants to buy their home with the benefit of a discount. The new Labour government has made a manifesto pledge to review the level of discounts, and as a result, the first budget announced significant changes. So broadly, there are counter-arguments here. I will give you both sides and you can make up your own mind, but that's what I like to do on this channel. The previous discount for right to buy was up to £102,000 across England and £136,000 in London boroughs. Now, the government's contention was that these higher discounts led to a depletion of social housing and sold properties that were not being replaced at sufficient rates, and therefore reduced accessibility to affordable rental and social housing. And so by reducing these discounts, they would ease the burden on building new houses and increase the access to affordable rental and social housing. However, the reduction on these discounts is substantial, down to 22, 26, 24,000 across most of England, and 30,000 in the southwest, for example, 38,000 in the southeast, and only 16,000 in London, but with some boroughs where it's 38,000. And so the obvious argument here is that it's going to make it very difficult for those long-term tenants to acquire their property having lost that discount. Now, I'm not telling you which side of this to believe, and I'm not saying which is better or worse, in fact, despite some people say that I'm always criticising everything that Labour's doing. That's not quite the case. What I am saying is that these sort of run counterintuitive to each other, to some degree at the very least. On the one hand, they are talking about making it easier for people to acquire properties, and on the other hand, they are increasing stamp duty and reducing these discounts, and therefore they are making it more difficult to obtain these properties. It can't be both. Now, this is obviously a very difficult situation to resolve, and so I don't want the criticism to seem too harsh, because it is a very difficult problem to solve. But at the same time, if it is a difficult decision, why not simply say that? Like, as I said with the earlier segment about this terror organization overthrowing the previous regime, however bad the previous regime was, it is still a terror organization overthrowing the regime. Why not say that? Why not be open and clear about it? Because we are all, I would suggest, we are all entitled to the full and frank disclosure of what's going on, and full and frank information about what they're trying to do here and the challenges that they face. Instead of making things up, instead of saying things they don't back up with facts and details, this is obviously a very difficult situation. And finally, just to complicate things yet further, Rachel Reeves is now talking about closer economic relationships with the rest of the EU. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I would think it's possibly bad timing, because I don't think we've sorted ourselves out yet. As I mentioned in my previous analogy, if you were running the country as a business, and arguably we should, because a successful business operates much the same way. You've got income, you've got expenditure, you've got processes, you've got direct costs, and etc. And really, we ought to tackle this expenditure first. We should cut off the spending that we absolutely can get away with, so that we can rebuild and repair ourselves first. And we need to do that before, as it suggests here, working on new economic relationships with the rest of the EU. Because with Brexit going, let's say it, I think it went badly. A lot of people didn't want it at all. Some people very much did want it, but perhaps they wanted it for the wrong reasons. I think it's fair to say that it didn't work very well so far. Broadly speaking, there are possibly some areas where people think it worked well, but I think broadly speaking it didn't. But I think because of all of that, I think that's going to make this very, very difficult to now get into good economic relations with the rest of the EU without fixing ourselves first. And I think we are far from fixed. Let me know in the comments what you think about that. I think there's a lot of people that think we are far from fixed at the moment, and people that I trust, serious economists that are very concerned about the state of affairs in the UK at the moment. They think that we are not yet fixed and need fixing. And so to summarise, we have people that are not supposed to be in this country committing crimes who we are then paying for, that then disappear, and they go by all sorts of different names. The government won't give you the statistics of how many crimes those people are committing. There's hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on these people, whilst hundreds of millions of pounds being cut from the police forces that are there to protect us from not just these people that are committing crimes, but in general, hundreds of millions of pounds cut from those police officers. We now have the situation of dealing with another regime which is currently on the terror list, which we're not supposed to deal with, because we're not supposed to deal with terrorists, but they want to deal with that country, and therefore they're now just thinking of taking it off the list, and therefore suddenly it's okay to deal with them. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I am not an expert on those things. I would leave that to the experts, and I would really hope that it is left to the experts and not some people making other decisions, but I would really hope that it's left to the experts. And then we have this whole thing with the housing crisis. Is there a housing crisis, or are there plenty of houses? Are we trying to help people buy their houses, or are we making it more difficult by increasing stamp duty and cutting the benefits, the discounts rather, on the right to buy schemes? All of these things making it extremely difficult. All the while, by the way, the devastating effect on the economy is obviously going to have a devastating effect on interest rates. We've got the banks doubling down not only on increasing mortgage rates, but they are reducing the rates on savings as well. So we're hit twice. So at the same time as there is a risk to income from employers possibly cutting salaries because they can't afford the employer national insurance, you see why I think we're in a bit of a mess. But Either way, I am here on this channel to say it as it is. I think there's not enough people saying it as it is, saying what we all really think, saying the things that really need to be said and things that really need to be discussed, and calling things out where I see them. And that I will continue to do. This channel is not just about law, any longer at least. I have thousands of videos on law. For those of you who are interested in law, you can dig into the library. I will still pick up, I promise you, stories on law and changes in law and everything that affects you. But all of this at the moment very much does affect you. I am independent. I depend on you. I only have you to thank for subscribing and helping me to grow my channel to reach a wider audience. I am here for you. And so with that, thank you for watching.